The fog hung thick over the rolling hills of Lorraine, France, on the morning of September 19, 1944. Lieutenant Edwin Leeper squinted through the mist from his position atop Hill 246, the cold steel of his M18 Hellcat tank destroyer beneath him. Somewhere in that gray wall of vapor, German Panther tanks were advancing, 60 tons of sloped armor and death, machines that had made Allied tankers say their prayers since Kursk. Leeper's crew had been rushed to this godforsaken hilltop before dawn by Captain William Dwight, the liaison officer for the 37th Tank Battalion. 4 Hellcats. A handful of men. And between them and the advancing 5th Panzer Army stood only morning mist and doubt. Then something changed. Something that would turn this fog-shrouded morning into a graveyard for the Third Reich's finest armor. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened at Aricourt, what the Germans would later call witchcraft, what their tank commanders would whisper about in fear, we need to go back. Back to the drawing boards of Aberdeen Proving Ground, where American engineers wrestled with an impossible problem. How do you kill a Panther? By the autumn of 1944, the Sherman tank had become a coffin with treads. Oh, they'd tell you it was reliable, easy to maintain, that 5 Shermans could take 1 Tiger if they flanked it properly. What they didn't tell you was that 4 of those 5 Shermans would burn. The crews had a name for their tanks: Ronsons. Lights first time every time. The mathematics of death were simple and brutal. A German Panther's 75mm gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at 2,000 yards. The Sherman's 75mm gun? It bounced off a Panther's glassy plate like a pebble off castle walls, unless you were within 300 yards and hit it just right. In tank warfare, 300 yards meant you were already burning. Technical Sergeant James Rothscadle of the 4th Armored Division would later write in his diary, "The first time I saw a Panther, I was sure I was looking at my own death. We hit it 3 times, center mass, good shots. The shells just sparked off like we were throwing rocks. Then it traversed its turret toward us and I knew that was it. We got lucky, American artillery bracketed him before he could fire. But I learned something that day: our tanks were outgunned, out-armored, and we were only alive by the grace of God and the skill of our artillery boys." Colonel Bruce Clark, commanding Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, understood the grim arithmetic. His men had swept across France with speed and daring, but now, pressed against the German frontier in Lorraine, they faced panzer brigades equipped with Panthers and the occasional Tiger. Speed and tactics could only take you so far when the enemy could kill you from beyond the range at which you could hurt them. But something was coming. Something the Germans didn't know about. Something that would arrive just in time. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the Americans had been working on a secret. They called it HVAP, High Velocity Armor Piercing. The British called it APCR, Armor Piercing Composite Rigid. The Germans, who had their own version, called it Hartkern, Hardcore. But whatever you called it, the principle was the same: tungsten carbide. Tungsten carbide. The hardest material in the American arsenal, harder than the finest German armor plate, harder than anything that rolled off the assembly lines at Krupp or Tyson. A subcaliber penetrator wrapped in a lightweight aluminum sabot, fired at velocities that seemed impossible. From a 76mm gun, these rounds screamed out of the barrel at 3,400 feet per second, nearly 500 feet per second faster than conventional armor-piercing shells. The physics were elegant and deadly. The tungsten core, just 38mm in diameter but dense as sin, would strike armor with such concentrated force that it didn't just penetrate. It created a jet of superheated metal that carved through steel like a cutting torch through butter. The Germans who survived these hits would swear the shells melted through their armor. In a way, they were right. But tungsten was rare, desperately rare. The same tungsten needed for HVAP was needed for cutting tools in every factory building bombers and rifles and artillery pieces. Production was agonizingly slow. By September 1944, only a handful of these rounds existed, and they were being hoarded like dragon's gold. The first distribution of HVAP ammunition to frontline units occurred on September 11, 1944. 8 days before Aricourt. 8 days before everything changed. The shells came in wooden crates marked with stenciled warnings, distributed to tank and tank destroyer crews with instructions that bordered on reverence. Use them sparingly, make every shot count, these were more precious than gold. The 4th Armored Division received their allocation just as they crossed the Moselle River, just as they pushed into Lorraine, just as the 5th Panzer Army was massing for a massive counterattack. Some would later say it was providence. Others called it luck. The German tank crews who faced them would have another word entirely: hexerei, witchcraft. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, future Army Chief of Staff but then just a hard-charging tank battalion commander, gathered his officers on September 18 near the town of Aricourt. The 37th Tank Battalion had been driving deep into German-held territory, and now intelligence reported enemy armor concentrating in the forests ahead. "We've got something new," Abrams told them, his voice carrying the flat confidence of a man who'd been killing Germans since Normandy. "HVAP rounds. 6 per tank. The engineers say they'll punch through a Panther's front plate at 1,000 yards. There was silence. Then someone laughed, a short, bitter sound. "That's witchcraft, Colonel." "Maybe it is," Abrams replied. "But tomorrow we're going to find out." That night, Sergeant William Stacy of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion sat in his M18 Hellcat, turning one of the new shells over in his hands. It felt different. Lighter than a standard armor-piercing round, the weight distributed strangely. The nose was blunt, wrapped in that aluminum sabot that would supposedly fall away after firing. He'd been fighting in a Hellcat since France, and he'd learned that against a Panther you had one chance: hit it in the side or rear or die trying. Frontal engagement was suicide. But 6 of these magic bullets sat in his ready rack now. 6 chances to do the impossible. He didn't sleep much that night. None of them did. The fog rolled in after midnight, thick as wool, and with it came the distant rumble of diesel engines. The Germans were coming. September 19, 1944. 7 a.m. The fog was so thick that visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. Lieutenant Edwin Leeper's Hellcat crew had taken position on Hill 246, overlooking the approach to Rechicourt-la-Petite. They'd been there less than 15 minutes when the shape materialized from the mist, low, broad, the distinctive sloped armor of a Panther tank. Panther. 11 o'clock, 200 yards. Sergeant Stacy, commanding the lead Hellcat, didn't hesitate. The 76mm gun roared, and the world changed. The HVAP round struck the Panther's frontal armor with a sound like a thunderclap. But instead of the usual spark and ricochet, instead of the sickening bounce that meant you just signed your death warrant, the shell punched through. The tungsten core, traveling at speeds that defied belief, carved through 6 inches of German armor plate as if it weren't there. The Panther shuddered. Smoke began pouring from the hatches. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered over the radio. It went through. There was no time for celebration. More shapes in the fog, Panthers moving in column. Stacy fired again. Another hit, another penetration. Another German tank grinding to a halt with fire blooming from its engine deck. A third Panther emerged, and this one got its gun into action. The German shell struck Stacy's Hellcat, wounding the crew, but the thin-skinned American tank destroyer could still move. As it reversed off the hill, another Hellcat fired, HVAP round, center mass, through the front plate. The Panther's turret hatches blew open as ammunition cooked off inside. The German tank commander who survived that engagement, Oberleutnant Hans Schmidt of the 113th Panzer Brigade, would write in his after-action report, "Enemy shells penetrated frontal armor at ranges previously considered safe. Impossible penetrations. Several Panthers lost to frontal hits at 600 meters or more. Effect on crew morale significant." Effect on morale significant. That was German military speak for, "Our men were terrified." All along the line the story repeated itself. Captain Kenneth Lameson's C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, engaged Panthers emerging from the fog along the Metz-Strasbourg road. The German tanks had been advancing confidently. Why wouldn't they? Shermans with 75mm guns were no threat frontally, and these Germans had ruled the battlefield for 2 years. Then Lameson's tanks opened fire with HVAP. The first volley disabled 3 Panthers at 700 yards, frontal hits, punching through armor that had been impenetrable just days before. The surviving German tanks tried to reverse, but Lameson had already sent a platoon of Shermans to a commanding ridge near Bazenges-la-Petite. The Germans drove straight into the ambush. From a flanking position, the American tanks fired HVAP rounds into the Panther's side armor. At that angle, the tungsten penetrators went through both sides of the tank, in one wall, out the other like paper. 4 Panthers knocked out in the first volley. The remaining Germans searched desperately for the source of the fire, but the Shermans had already reversed behind a ridge line. Then they popped up again, fired another volley and disappeared. 4 more Panthers destroyed. The German survivors later reported engaging super-heavy American tanks, or new tank destroyers with massive guns. They wouldn't believe, that standard Sherman tanks had done this to them. Private First Class Robert Braun, a loader in one of Lameson's tanks, would remember, "We'd been scared of Panthers since we first saw one in Normandy. Everyone had stories, whole platoons wiped out, tanks brewing up one after another. But that morning with those HVAP rounds it was different. We could hurt them. Finally we could hurt them. I saw our gunner, Corporal Davies, crying after the fight. Not from fear, from relief. We didn't have to run anymore. By noon on September 19th, the German attack had stalled completely. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had rolled forward that morning with 43 serviceable Panthers, was in ruins. American tanks and tank destroyers had destroyed 43 German tanks. Mostly Panthers, the cream of the German armored force. The Americans lost 5 Shermans, 3 Hellcats and 6 men killed. The mathematics had reversed. The hunters had become the hunted. At Combat Command A headquarters near Aracourt, Colonel Bruce Clark reviewed the after-action reports with something approaching disbelief. His unit had been outnumbered, facing newer and heavier tanks, and had achieved a kill ratio of nearly 9-1. The HVAP ammunition had performed beyond anyone's wildest expectations. But perhaps more important than the destroyed tanks was what couldn't be measured in wrecked hulls and burned-out steel. German confidence had been shattered. For 2 years, Panther and Tiger crews had rolled into battle knowing they could engage enemy tanks from beyond the enemy's effective range. They could sit at 1,000 yards and methodically destroy their opponents while remaining essentially invulnerable from the front. Now suddenly nowhere was safe. American tanks could kill Panthers frontally at ranges the Germans had considered secure. The psychological impact was devastating. Oberfeldwebel Friedrich Weber of the 113th Panzer Brigade survived the September 19th engagement and wrote to his wife 3 days later, a letter that would be captured when he was killed on September 22nd. The Americans have something new. I don't know what it is. Some say new guns, others claim it's explosive shells that melt through armor. Whatever it is, it's killing Panthers from the front. Our advantages of range and armor mean nothing now. The men are frightened, Liebling. For the first time since I joined the Panzertruppen, I see fear in veteran crews. They say it's witchcraft. Maybe it is. The Germans didn't quit. That wasn't their style. On September 20th, Generaloberst Otto von Manschufel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, threw his 111th Panzer Brigade into another assault. Hitler himself was demanding results, demanding that Patton's Third Army be stopped before it reached the German frontier. The 111th Panzer Brigade attacked Combat Command A's headquarters directly. It should have been a slaughter, German Panthers against American headquarters units, artillery and support troops. Instead, it became another killing ground. The 191st Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with towed 155mm howitzers, fired at German tanks from a range of just 200 yards, point-blank range by artillery standards, close enough to see the faces of German tank commanders. When HVAP-equipped Hellcats and Shermans arrived, they systematically destroyed 5 Panthers in under an hour. By September 22nd, the pattern was well established. German tanks would advance. American defenders, now confident in their ammunition, would wait until the enemy was within range. And with HVAP, within range meant 1,000 yards or more. Then they would open fire and Panthers would die. The Battle of Juvilliers on September 22 demonstrated the new reality with brutal clarity. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams established a defensive position on Hill 257 with tanks from 2 companies and supporting infantry. When the 111th Panzer Brigade attacked, American tanks engaged at ranges from 400 to 2,000 yards. 2,000 yards. Against Panthers. Frontally. The result: 14 German tanks destroyed before they could close to effective range. The 111th Panzer Brigade withdrew in disorder, leaving behind 16 more tanks and 250 dead. American losses: 7 men killed, 13 wounded, 7 Stuart light tanks and 1 Sherman destroyed. Master Sergeant Tom Hendricks, a tank commander in Abrams's battalion, recalled, "We had them zeroed in at ranges I wouldn't have dreamed of engaging a Panther before. Every time that 76mm gun fired an HVAP round, it was like having the hand of God reach out and smite the enemy. The tungsten cores punched through their armor like it was cardboard. I saw one round go in the front of a Panther, blow through the fighting compartment and exit out the back. The crew never knew what hit them. But HVAP ammunition wasn't perfect, and it couldn't be everywhere. Each tank carried only 6 rounds, precious, irreplaceable. Once those 6 were expended, crews reverted to standard armor-piercing ammunition, and suddenly the old fears returned. Panthers were dangerous again. Tigers were death incarnate again. The 4th Armored Division's after-action reports repeatedly noted the same refrain: HVAP ammunition exhausted. Then casualties would spike. Then resupply would arrive and the Germans would start dying again. The scarcity of tungsten meant that HVAP could only be produced in limited quantities. While the battles raged in Lorraine, back in the United States, factories were retooling, mines were being expanded, priority designations were being upgraded. But it would take months before HVAP became common. For now, in September 1944, it was a secret weapon deployed in tiny quantities. The Germans knew something had changed, but they didn't know what. Captured Panthers were examined for new weak points, but there was nothing. The American shells were simply penetrating armor that should have stopped them. Intelligence reports speculated wildly: new guns, explosive shells, focused charges, uranium penetrators. The truth, that the Americans had developed a better armor-piercing round using tungsten carbide, wouldn't be confirmed by German intelligence until November 1944. By then it was too late. The psychological damage was done. Panther crews no longer felt invulnerable. Every engagement became a calculated risk rather than a turkey shoot. The Battle of Aricourt continued through September 29. For 11 days, American and German armor clashed in the rolling hills and forests of Lorraine. The final count was staggering. The German 5th Panzer Army lost 281 tanks and assault guns, 3,000 killed and 1,000 captured. The U.S. 4th Armored Division lost 25 tanks destroyed and 22 damaged, along with fewer than 200 casualties. It was the most lopsided American armored victory of the Western Front. And it could not have been achieved without HVAP ammunition. Colonel Bruce Clark, in his official report, wrote, "The HVAP round proved decisive in engagements with German Panther tanks. Crews reported successful frontal penetrations at ranges up to 1,200 yards. Morale effect on our troops was significant. They no longer feared the Panther." Conversely, captured German documents indicate severe morale problems in their panzer units following repeated penetrations of frontal armor. Severe morale problems. There was that phrase again. The Germans, who had terrorized Allied tankers from North Africa to Normandy, were now afraid. Their technical superiority had been erased by American industrial chemistry and metallurgy. But we need to talk about what those shells actually did. Because penetration is a clinical word, a sanitized word. The reality inside a tank hit by HVAP was something else entirely. When a tungsten carbide penetrator strikes armor at 3,400 feet per second, the impact generates temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The penetrator doesn't just punch through, it creates a jet of superheated, liquefied metal that sprays into the crew compartment. This molten jet is accompanied by spalling, fragments of the tank's interior armor breaking off and ricocheting around the crew space at supersonic speeds. Everything flammable ignites instantly. Ammunition cooks off. Fuel explodes. In the confined space of a Panther's crew compartment, there is nowhere to hide, no protection from the maelstrom of fire and fragmentation. German tanker Helmut Steinhardt, who survived his Panther being hit by what he believed was an HVAP round, wrote in his unpublished memoir, "There was no warning. One moment we were advancing through the fog searching for American positions. The next, the world ended. A sound like a bell being struck by a hammer, but magnified 1,000 times. A flash of white light. Heat, God, the heat. Schmidt, our loader, was simply gone, torn apart by something I never saw. The ammunition started cooking off and Muller and I bailed out through the top hatch. The tank was burning white hot, not the normal orange flames but something hotter, something that made the armor itself glow. They told us later it was a standard American 76mm gun. I don't believe it. I will never believe it. That was the reality of HVAP. That was what the Germans meant when they whispered about witchcraft. The success at Aricourt didn't end the war, of course. The Germans would launch one more massive armored offensive, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, and American tankers would once again face Panthers and Tigers in desperate circumstances. But by then HVAP ammunition was more widely available, and the lessons of Aricourt had been learned. The Sherman, once dismissed as a death trap, had been transformed. Not by redesigning the tank, that would take too long, but by giving it teeth. The 76mm gun firing HVAP could kill anything the Germans fielded, given a decent firing position and a steady hand. More importantly, American tank crews knew it. The psychological transformation was as important as the technical one. Men who had gone into battle expecting to die, hoping to at least slow down the enemy before their tank brewed up, now went into battle expecting to win. Corporal James Cooper, a gunner in the 4th Armored Division, summed it up in a letter home in October 1944. "Mom, I can't tell you what happened exactly, but something changed last month. We've got ammunition now that can knock out those German cats that used to scare us so bad. I shot a Panther last week. Went right through the front plate at 800 yards. The whole crew cheered. "We're not afraid anymore, Mom. We can win this. We're not afraid anymore." That might be the most important sentence written about armored warfare in 1944. Because wars aren't just won with steel and tungsten and high-velocity physics. They're won by men who believe they can win, who go into battle expecting victory rather than death. The Germans never developed an effective counter to HVAP. They tried. By the end of 1944, they were experimenting with additional armor plates, with spacing between armor layers with hardening treatments. But they were running out of time, resources, and luck. The noose was tightening from all sides. The Panther, that magnificent weapon that had terrorized Allied tankers since Kursk in 1943, had been dethroned. It was still dangerous. It could still kill you if you made a mistake, but it was no longer invincible. The American application of tungsten carbide to armor-piercing ammunition had leveled the playing field. And in a war of industrial production, where America could build 5 Shermans for every Panther Germany produced, a level playing field meant German defeat. The Battle of Aricourt was written up in training manuals, analyzed at staff colleges, held up as an example of combined arms warfare at its finest. American tanks, tank destroyers, artillery, infantry, and air power working in concert to defeat a larger German armored force. All true. But the veterans knew differently. They knew about those wooden crates that arrived on September 11th, marked with stenciled warnings. They knew about the tungsten cores that turned Shermans from victims into predators. They knew about the look on German prisoners' faces when they talked about American shells that melted through armor like butter. They knew about the witchcraft. Technical Sergeant James Rothscadle, whose diary entry about facing Panthers we heard earlier, survived the war. He returned to Iowa, married his sweetheart, raised 4 children, and rarely spoke about his service. But in 1979, while being interviewed for a local historical society project, he was asked about the most important moment of the war. He thought for a long time before answering. "September 19, 1944, he finally said. "The first day I fired an HVAP round. Up until then, we were just trying to survive, trying to use speed and tactics to make up for the fact that the Germans had better tanks. But that day everything changed. We had a weapon that could kill Panthers from the front. I know it sounds strange, but it was like somebody finally gave us a fighting chance. Before HVAP, combat was about managing fear and hoping to get lucky. After HVAP, it was about who was the better tanker. And I'll put American tankers up against anyone." He paused, his eyes distant, seeing something from 35 years before. "The Germans called it witchcraft. Maybe it was. But I prefer to think of it as American ingenuity. We couldn't match their armor, so we built better ammunition. We couldn't match their guns, so we made our guns more effective. That's what Americans do, we solve problems. And in September 1944, in the hills of Lorraine, we solved the problem of the Panther tank. The shell that melted German tanks like butter. They called it witchcraft. But it wasn't magic. It was metallurgy. It was physics. It was tungsten carbide cores driven by American industrial might and delivered by American crews who had learned their trade in the deadly schools of North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France. It was the moment when the hunted became the hunters. It was the moment when the Panther lost its claws. It was the moment when the outcome of the armored war in Europe became inevitable. And it all came down to a 38mm tungsten core, wrapped in aluminum, fired at velocities that seemed impossible, punching through armor that was supposed to be invulnerable. The Germans built better tanks. The Americans built better ammunition. In the end, that made all the difference. The fog rolled in thick over Lorraine on the morning of September 19, 1944. When it lifted, the battlefield was littered with burning Panthers, and the German Panzertruppen had learned a hard lesson. Technological superiority is temporary, but American industrial ingenuity is forever. They called it witchcraft. We call it victory.